Who are you? That's a strange question, isn't it? I mean, it's not a question that we ask ourselves very often, if at all. But you know what you are. I mean, you're not surprised by what you see in the mirror every morning. And you know how you are. You know that you part your hair to the right, you squeeze your toothpaste from the middle of the tube, and you eat your burger with only meat, cheese, and mayonnaise. I'm pretty sure I just described how Pastor Corey is, actually. You know what you are and how you are, but who you are? That is a bit of a mystery. When I ask, who are you, I'm really asking the question, what's your identity? And it may very well be that your identity is actually unidentifiable. And that would make sense because we're all born with an identity crisis. We're born with a sin nature and we're separated from God as a result. And who we are apart from God is confusing. We aren't exactly sure who we are, so we try to find our identities in anything, everything, whatever makes sense at the time. And that really is an identity crisis because your view of you affects what you do. It'll impact who you hang out with, what decisions you make, how you treat your body, how you treat others. And to add to the complexity of this crisis, because most of us don't know who we are, we defer to other people for them to fill in the blanks for us. Parents, classmates, coaches, teammates, friends, people we don't even know on social media. Not to mention the $17 billion that's spent each year on ads trying to convince us of who we are or who we should be, if you buy their product, of course. It seems like everywhere we look, there's some type of a message about who we are, who we're not, and who we should be. But here's the thing. We tend to place more value on negative messages than positive messages. In fact, not only do the negative messages outweigh the positive, we usually remember them longer. And these collected messages can become who we think we are. You see, we don't often know how to fill in the blank about who we are, so we let other people fill in the blank for us. When they talk, we listen. And this is totally normal because you don't have a lot of available time in your schedule each day to figure out who you are. You're worrying about algebra, Snapchat, what's for lunch, your crush, video games, baseball practice, and annoying siblings. Figuring out your identity is not on the top priority of your list. I totally get it. But if we understand how much the answer to that question, the question of who are you, actually impacts your life, then you might spend more time thinking about it. Remember, your view of you affects what you do. So you and I have some work to do. We have to figure out which messages can stay and which messages need to go. We have to test and question the labels that have been placed on us, and we have to decide who gets input into our identity and who doesn't. You might say that our identities need to be anchored and secured to a constant voice, a consistent voice, a correct voice. Now, chances are, because this is coming from a pastor, you've already figured out where we're going with this. This constant, consistent, correct voice that our identities need to be secured in is the voice of the one who created you, God. But don't turn your brains off yet, because if we really get this right, it can not only help us figure out who we are, but also help us figure out who we're not supposed to be. In fact, what we're talking about has the power to change how we see ourselves forever. So, we're going to take a quick glance at a verse from a letter in the New Testament written by one of Jesus' friends, John. John was one of the most famous of the 12 disciples and was most likely the youngest of the 12 when he first started following Jesus. And not only that, he actually lived the longest. In the first several years following Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, when Christianity was actually illegal, almost all of the disciples were killed for their faith. But somehow John managed to stay alive, making it to old age. And John knew that he was one of the last people alive who actually walked and talked with Jesus. John knew that time was running short, and he was desperate to make sure that people knew what God thought of them before the memory of Jesus faded. So John wrote this in 1 John chapter 3. See how very much our Father loves us, for he calls us his children, and that is what we are. John was basically saying that God is crazy about you. Other translations say that God lavishes his love on us. It's like an overflow of love, unable to be contained. And that's a big deal, because so often you and I aren't big fans of ourselves. We see everything that's wrong with us, and we think, I'm not great at all. But John is saying God doesn't see it that way. He's a fan of you. He adores you. He loves you, and he likes you. But there's one other thing that makes this an even bigger deal. Unlike teachers and advertisers, even close friends and family, God actually knows who you are. The real you. Yep, he knows, and he still likes you and loves you. Thousands of years before John wrote this letter, God spoke to a kid named Jeremiah. He was a kid who didn't really think highly of himself, yet even became a prophet later on. God said, I knew you even before you were in your mother's womb. God knows you intimately. He knows you better than you know you, and He still loves you. He doesn't just know the 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. version of you with your well-presented self in front of your peers at school. He knows the 5 p.m. to 9 a.m. version of you, the one that is drooling on your pillow, waking up with a funky breath. He doesn't just love the fake version of you that you put out on Snapchat, but He loves the real you that is snappy and too chatty. The truth is this: no one knows us better than the one who created us. And no one should be able to fill in the identity blank for us more than or other than the one who made us. So when John says that God loves you, that's a message that should have more power. Why? Because God actually knows you, the real you, better than anyone else. And that's why what John says next makes so much sense. He says this: but the people who belong to this world don't recognize that we are God's children because they don't know Him. John is saying that the people in our culture don't always see the whole picture. They don't know God, so they're not good judges of God's children. John is giving this message to Christians for sure, but this is true even if you aren't a Christian. God is still the best judge of who you are, and the people around you cannot be a good judge of the real you. I mean, think about it. They didn't make you. They don't even know who they are. All the times you've been told that you are something that you don't want to be or aren't something that you do want to be, remember, those messages came from people, a teenager or an adult, who are still trying to figure out who they are and feel better about themselves. Or think about it this way: if you wanted to know how tall you were, you wouldn't ask a random person what they thought. If you asked an 8-year-old kid, they'd say, "You're huge." If you asked an NBA player, on the other hand, they'd say, "You're super short, bro." Simply put, people, they see things from their biased perspective and worldview. In reality, if you want to know how tall you are, just get a tape measure. At that point, it's not based on perspective or opinion, it's based on accuracy. And that's true of your identity too. If you want to know and who you are and who you should be, then you can't rely on people around you because their perspective is biased and it's always changing. God, on the other hand, is constant. He isn't trying to sell you anything. He doesn't need to feel better about himself. He doesn't have a perspective problem. His view of you is based on His creation of you. That means that if you want to know who you are, trust what God says. Because here's the thing: what God says about you is the most important thing about you. So what would it look like for you to allow what God says about you to shape you in the same way? What if you stop filling in the blank with, "Hello, my name is stupid, ugly, invisible, or worthless," and you began to fill in that blank with, "Loved child of God"? I'm guessing that you feel different, make different decisions, treat yourself differently, treat others differently. And look, you can't stop people from making comments about who you are. You can't force the world around you to stop advertising products trying to convince you that there's something wrong with you. You'll never control how often or how loudly the messages come in about you, but you can drown them out. You can continuously remind yourself what God thinks about you. You can stay so connected to Him that His voice is louder than anyone else's. And you can surround yourself with friends and life group leaders who will repeat what's true about you over and over. You also have the privilege to do the same in those in your own life. So the question is, who are you?